Greetings. In the last several mini lectures, I introduced you to the British Prime Minister. And in this mini lecture, I want to introduce you to the other part of the executive branch, which is the British Cabinet. So, a few things. What you should notice in your readings, and certainly one of the things that I will stress in this mini lecture, is that the British Cabinet is very different than the American Cabinet. The British cabinet is usually slightly larger, although not really enough to matter. The British cabinet usually has around 17 members of parliament. The U.S. cabinet has 15. We have seen cabinets as large as 24. But the big difference is that in the British cabinet, we have members of the House of Commons. In other words, because of fusion of powers in Britain, uh, people serve in both the legislative branch and some serve in the executive branch at the same time. Unlike in the United States, where cabinet secretaries usually are not very powerful politically, they're usually experts in a particular field. In Great Britain, cabinet secretaries are leaders in their political party. Many of them have a lot of political experience, perhaps 10 or even as much as 20 years in the House of Commons. They serve a very predictable, what I would call an apprenticeship, typically starting out as MPs, that would be Member of Parliament, which would mean a regular member of the House of Commons. Given some time, they then usually are extended some patronage, usually becoming a junior cabinet minister and then eventually a full cabinet member. As I pointed out, historically the cabinet began as ministers to the king. However, as the House of Commons became more democratic, the cabinet secretaries, rather than being responsible to the king, became more responsible to the parliament or the House of Commons, which is true to this day. I came up with a couple of overviews about the cabinet to supplement your lecture material. And I would say that one of the huge contrasts between the American and British cabinet is that in the United States, cabinet secretaries are usually experts from either universities or from the business world. They usually do not have any experience in the Congress, although there are several exceptions to this. I think about Senator Lloyd Benson was an example. Hillary Clinton was an example who was in Congress and then ended up serving in Barack Obama's cabinet. Les Aspin, Mike Espy. There's a variety of these individuals. But usually, cabinet secretaries are going to come from outside of Congress and may come from really unusual places. I know Lyndon Johnson, for example, had the head of GM, Robert McNamara, serve in his cabinet, for example. In the United States, the president can ignore the cabinet, which Abraham Lincoln did on a regular basis. Sometimes he would go to them for advice and they'd give him advice and he'd basically, say no, because I feel the other way. Richard Nixon was even more suspicious than Abraham Lincoln. Nixon and one of his trusted advisors, John Ehrlichman, who was counsel to Richard Nixon and kind of gave him a lot of advice on domestic affairs, used this term going native, right? That cabinet secretaries, even if they start out loyal to the president, eventually lose their loyalty to the president and adopt the views of their agencies. And so they become spokespersons for their agencies instead of the president, and therefore they undermine the president's policies in many cases. John Ehrlichman said this in a very I find humorous way. You may or may not find it as humorous as I do. But he said, and you can read in your notes, cabinet secretaries come to the White House, they eat our food, they drink our booze, and then they run off and marry the natives. And so Ehrlichman was saying that the president, Mr. Nixon, shouldn't rely on the cabinet, should rely on people like me, our Mr. Haldeman, who was famous for saying every president needs a son of a bitch and I'm Nixon's. I'm his buffer and his bastard, right? I'm totally loyal to the president. I don't have any other agenda other than the president. Um, in Britain, however, the relationship is very different. Yes, the prime minister is more than one of equals. However, cabinet members have real political clout that cannot be ignored by a prime minister. I mentioned earlier in an earlier mini lecture that it was party leaders, it was cabinet secretaries that essentially pressured both Margaret Thatcher and Tony Blair, the two most successful prime ministers in terms of politically. They won 3 straight elections. But both of them ended up losing their jobs because they were pressured to resign by their own cabinets, by their own party leaders, and told if you don't resign, then the House of Commons is going to vote no confidence in you. And so they ended up resigning. Now, that does not mean that the cabinet doesn't have weaknesses. The cabinet is dependent on the support of the House of Commons, or they must resign. Cabinet secretaries can also be fired by the prime minister. So, unlike the American cabinet that draws its members from multiple elements in society, the British cabinet comes from one place, the House of Commons. As a result, and I would put several stars here, as a result, the British cabinet is far stronger than the American cabinet, and put even more stars here. And individual British cabinet secretaries are far more powerful, far more important than their American counterparts because the future prime minister from that party is in almost all cases going to come from that cabinet. So if you are in the British cabinet, you have a shot of becoming the future leader of the country, of becoming the future prime minister. Obviously, you're not going to see a future president in an American cabinet. In fact, I'm trying to think of the last time in recent history that someone who was serving in a cabinet role was seen as a potential president. I guess it would be Hillary Clinton. And that's the only person I can think of in the last 40 years that was a cabinet secretary that had the potential to rise up and become president. And of course, Hillary Clinton was defeated by Donald Trump. Under 2C, cabinet ministers are not chosen for their expertise in a specific policy area, but instead for their political qualifications. When I was at UC Davis many years ago in the 1980s, one of our professors there had served in the House of Commons. He was an environmentalist. He was a professor of environmental studies. And I had a conversation with him one time, and he talked about how in Britain, one of the major differences between the British and the Americans is that Americans are really, really interested in expertise in very specific areas. And that in Britain, one of the very common ways to look at, for example, a cabinet secretary is that great minds are adaptable. That if you have a good mind, if you're a good administrator, you can oversee virtually any agency. And we saw that with that case study that I gave you earlier. Remember about Theresa May, that Theresa May served in multiple cabinet capacities before she became prime minister, with the thinking that she could serve in multiple roles as an administrator. Roskin also points out that British parties have multiple factions, and party leaders typically look to have various perspectives represented in the cabinet. And also keep in mind something I told you earlier, that because of collective responsibility, you can co opt your enemies. If you have people in your party that disagree vehemently with you, one way that you can silence them is to bring them into your cabinet. And it's very enticing for them to do so because, again, once you've achieved cabinet status, now you're looked at as potential future prime minister material. So it's a way to silence dissent, it's a way to bring about party unity. D, representation of fusion of powers. The British cabinet is very different than the American cabinet because it does serve as a bridge between the legislative and executive branches of government. Because cabinet secretaries are members of the House of Commons, because they do serve in the legislature, and because they are an executive officer by serving in the cabinet, uh, you see this very strong connection. And of course, most legislation comes from the cabinet that is introduced in the Commons. In the United States, this does not exist at all. There is a complete separation of powers. Cabinet members are not allowed to serve in another branch of government. And so the cabinet in both countries really illustrates the fundamental difference between fusion of powers, which exists in Great Britain, and separation of powers, which exists in the United States. And the last one, E, collective responsibility. This is a huge management tool for the prime minister. I mentioned earlier that the greatest weakness of prime ministers is they can be ousted by the people, they can be pressured to resign by the party, or the House of Commons can vote no confidence and basically compel the resignation of the government. But the prime minister has several tools to stay in office, like calling for elections earlier, by having a lot of patronage to put people in junior minister or in cabinet positions. But one of them is the prime minister can really silence dissenters in the party by having them in the cabinet. And collective responsibility is the doctrine that, in essence, silences criticism in public. It doesn't silence criticism behind closed doors, but it does silence criticism publicly. So when I ask you about collective responsibility on the exam, this is a doctrine that says that all cabinet members will support the final consensus of the cabinet in public, although again, they may argue heatedly in private during cabinet meetings. It should say cabinet meetings, not cabinet members in your notes. I'll try to remember to go in and fix that. If a cabinet minister feels real strongly about a matter, if a cabinet minister feels like they just absolutely on moral conscience or whatever reason cannot support that, then they're expected to resign. And certainly resignations have occurred. One of the things that really led to the demise of the May government was that she did lose some people who did resign. But if you take a look over the last century or so, there are relatively few examples of cabinet members resigning in protest because, in essence, they are removing themselves from potential positions of leadership, at least in the near future, although maybe not in the long-term future. So when we boil this down, certainly the British cabinet looks different than the American cabinet. The British cabinet is far more powerful, and individual members are far more powerful. And it really does demonstrate the difference between fusion of powers in Britain and separation of powers in the United States. I will talk next about the legislature, the House of Commons, in the Lords.